In 1996, two college students found a skull in the Columbia River in Washington state. The Columbia River near Kennewick, Washington, a town of barely 70,000 people. The spot was shallow, a bend in the river where sediment collects and the current slows. Bones had been washing out of the eroded bank for who knows how long before someone noticed. They thought it was a recent drowning victim. They called the county coroner. The coroner called a forensic anthropologist named James Chatters. More bones were recovered from the riverbank over the following days. Nearly a complete skeleton. It was one of the most complete ancient skeletons ever found in North America. One detail stood out immediately. A stone spear point was embedded in his hip bone, a cascade-type projectile. He had been wounded by a spear and survived. The bone had healed around it. Chatters examined the skull and made an observation that would ignite a firestorm. He said the skull didn't look Native American. He said it looked European. The skull shape, the facial proportions, the narrow face, and prominent nose bridge. He measured the skull using standard craniometric techniques and compared it to reference databases. The software placed the skull closer to European and Polynesian reference groups than to modern Native Americans. By the standards of mid-90s physical anthropology, the measurements looked wrong for a Native American. In 1996, ancient DNA analysis was still in its infancy. Skull shape was the primary tool. Then the radiocarbon date came back and everything escalated. The skeleton was over 9,000 years old, one of the oldest ever found in the Americas. A 9,000-year-old skeleton in North America that supposedly didn't look Native American. The discovery triggered one of the most divisive legal battles in American archaeology. 5 Native American tribes claimed the remains under the federal repatriation law known as NAGPRA. The Umatilla, Yakama, Colville, Nez Perces, and Wanapum all said these were the bones of an ancestor. They wanted the remains returned for reburial, according to their traditions. Sued to stop the repatriation. They wanted to study the bones first. The scientists argued the skeleton was too old and too different to be linked to any modern tribe. The case became a national flashpoint between science and indigenous rights. The legal battle lasted 9 years, thousands of pages of court filings, multiple appeals. Federal judges ruled and then were overruled. The case reached the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. The tribes argued the remains were ancestral under any reasonable reading of the law. The court ultimately sided with the scientists, ruling there was insufficient evidence of cultural affiliation before the DNA. And at the center of the argument was a facial reconstruction. They built a face from the skull, and the face looked European. That became the story. The reconstruction gave him narrow features, a pointed chin, and a prominent nose. The media ran the image worldwide. It became the defining visual of the controversy. Some compared the reconstruction to famous European actors. Others said it resembled Polynesian or Ainu populations. The implication was explosive. Had Europeans or Polynesians reached America before Native Americans? Became proof of a theory. But no one had tested the DNA. Not yet. For nearly 2 decades, the legal battle prevented comprehensive genetic testing. Requests for DNA testing were repeatedly delayed, denied, or caught in legal proceedings. The bones sat in storage at the Burke Museum in Seattle. While lawyers argued, tribes waited, scientists waited, the skeleton waited. For nearly 2 decades, one of the most important archaeological specimens in North America sat behind locked doors. The Army Corps of Engineers held legal custody. Access was severely restricted. Then, in 2015, a team led by Eske Willerslev at the University of Copenhagen published the results. They had extracted enough ancient DNA from a hand bone to sequence the genome. The Copenhagen lab was one of the most advanced ancient DNA facilities on Earth. The hand bone had been less exposed to river water than the rest of the skeleton. It yielded roughly 1% endogenous human DNA, enough for a low-coverage genome. When the DNA results came back, every assumption based on the skull shape collapsed. Kennewick Man was Native American, completely, unambiguously Native American. His genome placed him firmly within the Native American clade. Not European, not Polynesian, not Ainu. On genetic plots, he fell directly among modern indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest. The team ran the analysis multiple times using different statistical methods. Every method converged. The face they built from the skull was wrong. The DNA proved it. He belonged to them. The closest living relatives were members of the Confederated Tribes of the Colville Reservation, the very people who had claimed him from the beginning. The Colville had participated in the DNA study voluntarily. They provided their own samples for comparison. They trusted the science enough to put their own DNA on the table, and the science confirmed their claim. The tribes had been right all along. They waited 19 years for the science to confirm it. But here is the part of the story that demands careful examination. The skull measurements were not fabricated. They were real. But what they meant was wrong. Craniometry, the science of measuring skulls, had been a foundational tool in physical anthropology. For over a century, researchers assumed skull shape was a reliable indicator of ancestry. Narrow face equals European. Broad face equals East Asian. Round face equals African. The problem is that skull shape changes over time. It responds to diet, climate, and random drift. Ancient Native American skulls from 9,000 years ago do not look like modern Native American skulls. Not because the population was replaced, because skull shape evolved within the same continuous population. The shift from hunting to agriculture alone reshaped facial structures across generations. Softer diets meant smaller jaws. Changed breathing patterns meant narrower nasal apertures. The same phenomenon has been documented in populations worldwide. Skull shape changes. DNA does not. Japan, Australia, South America, Europe. Everywhere researchers looked, the same pattern held because he lived 9,000 years ago. Not because he came from Europe. The Kennewick Man case became a landmark demonstration that skull shape cannot predict genetic ancestry. The physical measurements said one thing, the DNA said another, and the DNA was right. And there is a broader context that makes the Kennewick Man story even more significant. The peopling of the Americas is one of the most debated questions in human prehistory. When did humans first arrive? Which route did they take, and who were they? Some researchers had argued that Europeans crossed the Atlantic during the Ice Age. Kennewick Man was their evidence. The Solutrean hypothesis proposed that Ice Age Europeans paddled across the North Atlantic to reach America. Stone tool similarities between European Solutrean points and American Clovis points were cited as proof. Kennewick Man's European-looking skull was added to this argument. A 9,000-year-old European in America. The theory gained popular traction. Books were written, documentaries were filmed, and then the DNA destroyed it completely. Zero European ancestry. Not a trace, not a fragment. Every marker, every segment, every chromosome, all tracing back to an East Asian source population. The confidence interval left no room for ambiguity. This was as clear as ancient DNA results get. 9,000 years old. Native American. End of debate. Kennewick Man's ancestors came from Asia via Beringia, the same route as every other ancient American. His genome confirmed the standard model, Asians crossing into the Americas. No European shortcut. What happened after the DNA results changed the legal landscape entirely? In 2016, Congress passed legislation ordering the return of the remains to the tribes. After 19 years of legal battles, the DNA settled it. The remains went home. The DNA evidence had made the legal case unambiguous. The remains met the NAGPRA criteria. 19 years of litigation ended with a single piece of genetic evidence. In February 2017, the remains were transferred to representatives of the 5 tribes. The Ancient One, as the tribes call him, was reburied at an undisclosed location. 9,000 years after his death, he returned to his people. The exact location of the reburial was not made public. The tribes chose to protect the site. The tribes always knew who he was. It took science 19 years to catch up. The repatriation was not just a return of bones. It was a return of narrative control. For 2 decades, others had told the story of the Ancient One. Now the tribes could write the ending, and the case changed the practice of physical anthropology permanently. No responsible researcher uses skull shape alone to determine ancestry. The field that once classified races by measuring skulls now defers to genomic evidence. Graduate programs now teach the Kennewick Man case as a cautionary tale about relying on morphology alone. The case reshaped how forensic anthropology is practiced in the United States and beyond. DNA does not replace physical anthropology, but it now overrules it when the two disagree. And Kennewick Man is not the only case where the disagreement mattered. Across the Americas, ancient remains are being reassessed using genomic tools. And in case after case, the DNA confirms what tribal oral histories always said. Spirit Cave Man in Nevada, over 10,000 years old, DNA confirmed Native American. Anzac Child in Montana, over 12,000 years old, DNA confirmed Native American. Buried with Clovis stone tools, the oldest known burial in the Americas, genetically ancestral to all Native Americans. Every ancient genome tested strengthens the same conclusion. The database of ancient American genomes grows larger every year. Every ancient genome tested in North America traces back to the same ancestral population. The people who arrived from Asia more than 15,000 years ago, and their descendants, from Alaska to Patagonia, from 12,000 years ago to 500, all one founding population. One migration, multiple waves perhaps, but all from the same Asian source. The genetic evidence is now overwhelming. Every study confirms the same founding population. The ancient one's genome was not an anomaly. It was confirmation of what the land always knew. No Europeans, no Polynesians, no one else. The first Americans came from Asia. Full stop. The ancient one rests now in the land where he lived and died 9,000 years ago. His face was rebuilt from measurements. The face was wrong. His genes told the truth. Today, a growing number of Native American scientists lead the genetic research on their own ancestors. The power to tell the story has shifted, and the genome is the reason. Collaborative models now ensure tribes maintain control over genetic research involving their ancestors. The era of studying indigenous remains without consent is ending. The DNA made that possible too. Institutional review boards now require tribal consultation before any genetic work on ancient American remains. Kennewick Man's skull told one story. His DNA told another. If this story changed what you thought you knew, consider subscribing. We cover DNA evidence that rewrites history every week, because bones can lie, but the genome never does.